Welcome, everyone, to our final lecture of the spring semester in our Harvard Museums of Science and Culture Egyptology lecture series. My name is Peter Manuelian, and I represent the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, formerly known as the Semitic Museum. Our speaker tonight joins us all the way from Cairo, although she's been with us right here in Cambridge for many months now. Maryam Ayed is Associate Professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo, or AUC. She studied Egyptology at AUC and received her BA there, then her MA at the University of Toronto, and finally her PhD from Brown University in 2003. From 2003 to 2010, Dr. Ayed served as Assistant Director of the Institute of Egyptian Art and Archaeology at the University of Memphis, Tennessee, where she was an assistant and then a tenured associate professor of Egyptology and art history. Back at the American University in Cairo, Dr. Ayed teaches the grammar of Middle Egyptian hieroglyphs, Egyptian literature and translation, Coptic, as well as graduate seminars on Egypt in the first millennium BC, Nubian cultures and society, and ancient Egyptian women in temple ritual. For the current academic year, she is visiting associate professor of women's studies and Near Eastern religions, and a research associate in the Women's Studies in Religion program here at the Harvard Divinity School. Where in a bit of unfortunate timing, she, like the rest of us, has been living her life not on campus, but on Zoom. She's the author of numerous publications, as well as the monograph God's Will, God's Wife, God's Servant, published by Routledge in 2009. And she's currently exploring the impact of class and gender on ancient Egyptian conceptions of death, revival, and the afterlife. Tonight, we're fortunate to have her join us to speak on performance and ritual in ancient Egyptian funerary practice. Without further ado, Dr. Ayed.
Thank you, Peter, for this wonderful introduction and for the invitation to speak tonight about ancient Egyptian funerary practices. And I just want to acknowledge the 295 people who were logged on to attend the lecture. I hope that you'll find it interesting. So, as Peter said, this year I'm really concerned about issues of gender and access to the afterlife. Anyone who's familiar with Egyptian culture realizes that you cannot generalize, not about the time period and not certainly about the type of religious genre or funerary text that you study to decide something like that. The evidence is great. We have an embarrassment of riches, really, in terms of what we have of ancient Egypt. So my focus this year is on specifically the opening of the mouth ritual. So therefore, the bulk of my talk today will be on that. And I am very intrigued by the fact that even though this is one of the most commonly attested rituals, we often still in scholarship treat it more like wallpaper, not looking at fundamental questions of who's the user, why is that person, why did that person decide to have that particular selection of texts, and what can that tell us about his or her funeral beliefs? For tonight, though, I wanted to examine another aspect of the opening of the mouth ritual, which is the fact that as a ritual, it's very much a performance. So we'll discuss a little bit about what that means in terms of Egyptian culture, how do we know what we know, the kind of evidence that we have, archaeological and textual and iconographic. So my title slide actually shows a facsimile of a New Kingdom tomb that shows in two registers the funerary procession at the top, the mummy being pulled by oxen and priests, and then in the bottom register you have what may be the statue of the deceased being attended by various priests, performing actually the opening of the mouth ritual on the statue. And then to your left, the mummy of the deceased is being purified by the pouring of cool water. And before the mummy behind the leopard-clad priest is an offering table that does have some of the implements used in the opening of the mouth ritual. Now, the opening of the mouth ritual is found from the Old Kingdom all the way through to the Roman period. Therefore, it's probably one of the longest used rituals of ancient Egypt. It's found on a plethora of mediums and a variety of styles. So here, for instance, in the bottom, again, we have the funerary procession that ends with the opening of the mouth of the mummy in front of the tomb, but this time it's from a Book of the Dead manuscript of the New Kingdom. Here's a fuller view of that manuscript. It belongs to Nebked, and presumably it came from Thebes. It's currently in the Louvre Museum, and it dates to the time of Amenhotep III. Now, this is one of the best illustrated depictions of the opening of the mouth on papyrus, on a Book of the Dead, as a vignette of the Book of the Dead. And you see here all the main constituent elements. So again, the priest wearing leopard skin, holding that very special adze. Behind him is a mourning woman. She's holding her head in a gesture of mourning. And then behind that woman, in those little cups, are gigantic pellets of incense, also used in purification. And if you look behind the oxen, there is another leopard skin-clad priest right there who also holds a long incense burner. Now, in ancient Egypt, incense and cool water were sometimes interchangeable in terms of purification materials. So whereas here we had the water being poured over the mummy to purify it, in the bottom we do have the incense burner serving the same purpose. So there's been some discussion as to whether the opening of the mouth was carried out on the statue of the deceased or on his or her mummy. And I think that as long as the statue has the full name and titles of the deceased, whether it's the statue or the mummy is more or less a moot point, because once the statue is inscribed with the deceased's titles and names, personal name and genealogy, then that statue or that object becomes fully imbued with the deceased's personality. Functionally, though, it's a bit different. The mummy needed the mouth to be opened, the eyes to be touched, the ears to be touched, as part of a process that restored the senses to the mummy. The restoration of the senses, being able to eat, to breathe, to speak again, was a constituent part of enjoying the afterlife, enjoying food, enjoying the ability to breathe, the ability to see, the ability to hear, etc. And you see here in the bottom, the ba of the deceased is going down the burial shaft to where the mummy is laid to rest, bringing the deceased various food offerings. In another example of the Book of the Dead showing the opening of the mouth ritual, we have a more complex scene here with more individuals participating in the opening of Honefer's mummy's mouth, in participating in the opening of Honefer's mouth. So again, the mourning women, an integral part of that ritual. Again, the leopard-clad priest, who here holds both a jar from which he pours cool water as well as an incense burner, so double purification for Honefer. More priests are using different implements to open the mouth, including the golden finger and the adze. And the adze supposedly is made of meteoric iron, so extraterrestrial iron imbued with magical powers. We'll come back to this representation of this very ornate offering table at the bottom, but I just want you to look at it for a minute and see how every single implement that is used in that ritual is represented on it. So not only the adzes and the golden finger and the different jars held by these priests, but more objects that we'll see in a minute. Different types of adzes, even the leopard skin worn by the priest is there, but also little jars that would include cool water and incense and various other things. Now, one of the main reasons why the opening of the mouth is so ubiquitous is that it's also used in non-funerary contexts. So you can use it to open the mouth of the cult statue in the temple so that the statue is able to partake of the offerings placed before it, the god, not the statue, of course. But it's also used to render a temple functional. So you can do an opening of the mouth ceremony for an entire structure so that the temple will become functional again. And here are more instances where it's performed for God. In this case, it's the Apis bowl. There are few instances, very few instances, where the opening of the mouth is represented in royal tombs. And that in and of itself is a bit of an issue because presumably in the New Kingdom, kings had a different pathway to the afterlife than non-royal individuals. But in the tomb of Seti I, KD 17, we have one of the most extensive and one of the best preserved versions of the opening of the mouth ritual. So here again, the leopard-clad priest is opening the mouth and the eyes of Seti I, who's here represented like a statue on a pedestal rather than as a mummy. And in this bleached out scene right here, another priest is holding the foreleg of an ox and is using that foreleg to open the mouth of the statue. Now, it's been assumed that because the foreleg continues to twitch even after it's severed from the bull to which it once belonged, that twitching was considered in ancient Egypt as a sign of life. And therefore, by using the foreleg to open the mouth of the deceased, some of that life that is still exhibited through the twitching would be transferred to the statue or to the mummy of the deceased. So here it's used as if it's an adze to open the mouth as well. And from the tomb, another royal tomb, the tomb of Tawasret, KV 14, we again encounter the opening of the mouth and the eyes of this female king, who's here represented as a male statue standing on a pedestal. She ruled as a pharaoh for maybe a year or two, very briefly. And of course, in KV 62, King Tut is having his mouth opened by none other than Ai, his successor, who here is again wearing the leopard skin and is acting as the funerary priest for the deceased king in an act that aimed to legitimate his reign and his claim to the throne. Traditionally, the funerary priest, especially in the Old Kingdom, was the eldest son of the deceased. So the eldest son typically is the rightful heir and successor to the deceased father. In this instance, though, Ai is performing the opening of the mouth to gain legitimacy. He's claiming that by performing all the proper rites for the deceased king, he then becomes the rightful heir. But again, here, I just want to draw your attention to the adze being held by Ai. And interestingly, here, King Tut is represented as Osiris. So in this instance, it's Ai as Horus opening the mouth of King Tut, who here appears as if he is Osiris. Now, one of the most extensive versions of the opening of the mouth ritual occurs in the tomb of Rechmi Rey, the vizier from the 18th dynasty, TT 100. For the most part, Rechmi Rey appears as a statue in this series of reliefs, which are found in his corridor. A significant chunk of the opening of the mouth ritual involves purification. So purification by water, purification by different kinds of incense. This is the passage, this long passage where the opening of the mouth occurs. It is inscribed opposite another wall that on which Rechmi Rey is represented, supervising various craftsmen who are preparing his funerary equipment and making provisions for offerings through all eternity for him. And then immediately opposite that is a very complex layout of the opening of the mouth ritual. Now, typically when people think of the New Kingdom opening of the mouth, they think of that representation with the slanting roof line of the different episodes of the opening of the mouth depicted for Rechmi Rey, but in fact this particular layout is the exception, not the rule. In the royal tombs that we discussed just a minute ago, the scenes are represented opposite one another. And if you look very closely, you'll notice that there are numbers, right? See, like here, 74C, 47, 44, 28. The Egyptologists in attendance would immediately understand that those numbers are just our common way of referring to different scenes instead of launching into very lengthy descriptions of a butchery scene and the severing of the foreleg. Instead, we would just say OMR 43, OMR 23, which is the same down here. So conventionally, whether it's the Book of the Dead, whether it's pyramid texts, whether it's coffin texts, or here the opening of the mouth ritual, everything is numbered in our field, and we have fallen into the habit of referring to scene numbers or spell numbers by these numbers that were developed by Egyptologists in the past century or so, without often considering issues of layout or order. Now, I was intrigued a little bit by these non-sequential numbers that you see here in the tomb of Rechmi Rey. So that led me to dig up a little bit. And when we talk about a scene number in the opening of the mouth, we're referring to these discrete episodes that could range from 3 columns to 8 columns, and they usually accompany a vignette or a representation of various aspects of the ritual enactment of that rite. So sometimes the text describes what the scene depicts, other times the text merely complements what is being represented. So this is what is meant by a scene, OMR scene or opening of the mouth scene, basically the vignette and the associated texts underneath. Now here in the tomb of Seti is how these numbers were developed. In the late 1880s, Schiaparelli published the tomb of Seti and his funerary rites, and he numbered the scenes as he encountered them upon entering the tomb, so that the title and scene 1 are the first scenes encountered on the left-hand side wall as one walks into the tomb. The numbers then proceed from 1 to 26, and then immediately opposite 26 is scene number 27, and then the numbers are then counted sequentially all the way out again. So these numbers were done for the convenience of the scholar who published the tomb, but they mean nothing in and of themselves. And in many ways, they disrupt the process of trying to understand the ritual and how it was used in each monument. So if we look, for instance, at this title in scene 1, we see that it represents Seti I seated before an offering table. The offering table is highly stylized, reed leaves representing loaves of bread. The Sem priest, shown here wearing the leopard skin and a side lock of youth, is consecrating the offerings for him. Now, immediately opposite that is the grand offering list, which has its own number according to that system, like 57 and 71 and whatnot. But the scene depicting Seti is, in fact, a summary of that very elaborate offering list, so that as one enters that tomb, if you read the text in parallel, whatever is on the right parallels that which is on the left. So rather than waiting to go all the length of the corridor and back, these scenes should be read in parallel as one enters the tomb. Their content is complementary, and that makes sense. And I've been able to show that in published work already. So, for instance, scenes 26 and 27 are the innermost pair of scenes in that tomb, and they are the scenes that most explicitly show the opening of the mouth proper, using these very special instruments, the meteoric iron adze, and whatnot. My own work, which began way back when I was still at Brown on the opening of the mouth, has focused on Amenirdes, who was the god's wife of the 25th dynasty, about 500-600 years after the tomb of Seti was constructed. She too has one of the most extensive selections, and you can see her here having her eyes and her mouth opened by two priests, not just one. And both priests are labeled as a Sem and Lector or Kheri Habet priest. So these scenes are usually very explicit. The actors are all labeled. Sometimes the conversations between the different ritualists is recorded in the inscriptions. And once again, we see that that's her statue rather than her mummy that is shown here. The scenes are found in her funerary chapel at Medinet Habu, the facade of which is shown here along with her alabaster statue from Cairo. The architecture of the chapel itself is quite interesting. Amenirdes, her successor, their architects, whoever was responsible for constructing this, resurrected a very old architectural form known as the tent shrine that was already in use in the Third Dynasty when the step pyramid complex was constructed at Saqqara. But their innovation lay in placing one tent shrine within another, so that in the space created between the two structures, you have this very narrow corridor, less than a meter in width and over 4 meters in height. And her entire funerary texts, the opening of the mouth, solar hymns, and pyramid texts are inscribed on these outer walls of this corridor. They're color-coded here on this plan so that the green represents the opening of the mouth, which occurs on all 4 walls. The pyramid texts are color-coded orange, and the solar hymns on the back wall or the south wall in yellow. Now, it's very common for the opening of the mouth ritual to be written and read in retrograde. A retrograde mode of writing means that instead of reading into the glyphs, one starts reading into the backs of the hieroglyphic signs. So that if one considers the direction of reading and the layout of the text in her chapel, we're led to the conclusion that In addition to being arranged along a central axis, these are meant to be read from the doorway inward. If one follows the normal progression of reading those texts. It also means that the conclusion of the ritual would be on her back wall or on her south wall in the back, right there. In the 1930s, Chicago House took on the full photographic documentation of this chapel. Many of the very good pictures are available on their website, and I'm grateful for that. Because of the nature of the space available, it's very hard to get entire sections of the wall at once. So I'm grateful for having access to this material. You can see here on the back wall or the south wall, her mouth is being opened using the foreleg. And a Sem priest, again with the side lock of youth and the leopard skin, is consecrating offerings for her. And her mouth being opened by the two priests that we discussed just a minute ago. So following that order of reading, it seems that priests, even one priest on either side of that central axis going in, would read or recite those spells as they encounter them in the order in which they appear. This is problematic. It's not problematic because it's not the case. I think it's very much the case. It's problematic because it reverses our understanding of the opening of the mouth ritual. Because right on the south wall here, where that big red arrow is, are the so-called preliminary scenes, which in this chapel appear as the concluding scenes, according to my understanding of her texts. It's also problematic because a few people who have worked on the opening of the mouth ritual on monuments, like in monumental versions like this one, are still very reluctant to see a logical progression of these texts. So they don't see them running in parallel. They don't see the thematic continuity that hands off one section of the wall to the next, but instead are happy to follow that arcane numbering system and claim that, okay, for all Egyptian rituals, it's okay for the numbers to go zigzag, jump over. But that's not the case. The Egyptians were very systematic and very logical, and their use of funerary texts was for a purpose. And that purpose was to help them achieve an afterlife, in this instance, by restoring the senses to the deceased. And treating their inscriptions as wallpaper will not get us anywhere, because definitely they did not treat their inscriptions as wallpaper. They were very careful about the selections. Very individualistic selections were made. They were very careful about the layout. All the different versions I studied are very thoughtfully laid out. And all that is to achieve the ultimate purpose of a building. These tombs or funeral chapels, they are houses for eternity. The Egyptians lived in mud brick houses, but chose to build their tombs and funerary chapels in stone so that they would last forever. And indeed they have. So that's what the south wall looks like. Aminirenas, for the first time, appearing more animated. She's no longer a static statue, but instead she extends a hand to the stylized offering table that is being consecrated by the priest, because finally her mouth is fully opened. She's able to eat, she's able to speak. And as her first act of worship, she immediately under that double scene of her partaking of the offerings, she starts her ascent to the sky, her way out of the chapel by an act of worship, by worshiping two versions of the sun god, Ra-Horakhti, the sun at dawn, on the eastern side, and Ra-Atum, the sun at dusk or at sunset on the western side. So again, the layout matches the cardinal points of these deities and what they represent, rising and setting suns. Back to this master representation of the ritual, of the opening of the mouth ritual, I try to color code her different walls. So in yellow here are the slaughter scenes, which appear on the north wall of her chapel, and then the long walls in red and in green, that's the east and the west walls, and then finally in purple, the innermost southern wall, which in her chapel acts as the western wall, where normally behind which would be the burial shaft if it were a regular tomb, but hers is a chapel and it's a bit different. But again, the conclusion would be what appears here in the tomb of Rahmi Ray as the preliminary scenes. Initially, I wasn't going to include this line of comparison, but one of my main points to make tonight, and one of the main objectives of my research this year, is to treat each individual selection of the opening of the mouth as its own corpus, a trend that has finally started to happen in pyramid text studies. I think it should also happen for the opening of the mouth, because while synchronic cenobitic editions are important for the reconstruction of lacuna and for the understanding of the individual scenes, they don't tell us about the functionality of these funerary texts as intended for the individual deceased to achieve an afterlife. So treating each monument as representing a corpus would help us understand the narrative and the purpose behind the decorative scheme of each monument. That's my point. To show you how that would differ for a different selection, in the 25th, 26th tomb in the Asasif belonging to the priest Petimonophis, he too has one of the largest selections of the opening of the mouth, but you'll find that his selection is quite different from Amenerdis's, and in his tomb the layout is simpler. It's just two walls opposite one another. And here they are color-coded. So if we go back to Amenerdis, you can see just by looking at this slide how much more complex her layout is, but also how they have different selections. So for instance, she has nothing of the upper three registers in Rahmi Ray, whereas Petimonophis does, and he doesn't have any of the first 22, 23 scenes, at least at the time of the publication of Dumishan. There is now work ongoing in the tomb of Petimonophis, and hopefully they will have identified more opening of the mouth scenes there. My point being that it's a different corpus, different selection, achieving a different purpose for each individual. When confronted with lack of space, what did the Egyptians do? They actually selected the most iconic features for them from the opening of the mouth, condensed them into a double act of one man, one priest, holding both the golden finger and an instrument for opening of the mouth, and an incense burner, an instrument for purification, while one woman is acting as the mourner. Mourning was an integral part of funeral rites in ancient Egypt, and having the mourner, who may represent Isis and Nephthys, or who may just bring about the sadness of departure, which was an integral part of overcoming death. You acknowledge the sadness and then you overcome it. So on these New Kingdom stela, the entire ritual is abbreviated into ritual purification and an act of opening of the mouth. And again, for lack of space, they would select phrases from each of the scene numbers shown here. And again, the numbers are used for convenience. It's a shorthand of saying it's one of these groups or sequences of spells or scenes or chapters. Comparing this very abbreviated representation of the ritual with what we find on the Book of the Dead of Nabked, you see that also here the scene is abbreviated to two actors, the priest who holds the adze and the mourning woman who's pulling her hair out. There are a few New Kingdom stela that have the opening of the mouth ritual on them, and these have been published in 1984. And for all of them, even though the iconography may be different, the careful selection of parts of the purification rites and parts of the opening of the mouth proper is found. So the iconography may differ a little bit. So here in the top register, you see more people, more women. 4 women are mourning. I think there are 3 mummies that are being purified and whose mouth is being opened collectively by one priest, who is followed by more individuals. Another example, this one from the Art Institute of Chicago, doesn't really show the adze in the hand of the priest. Instead, they're more concerned with the purification of the mummy through the pouring of water, maybe the burning of some incense in this very long incense burner. But what do you find behind the priest? Again, a very elaborate selection of all the different implements and garments and vessels needed for the enactment of the ritual. So even when confronted with lack of space, they would manage to include all the necessary equipment for this ritual. And on the other side of that table is probably a lector priest who's reading from a manuscript. And above his manuscript are the words, the opening of the mouth. Okay, so it's very clear what's going on here. If you can read Egyptian, of course. Now, in the Book of the Dead of Hunefer, we discussed how there's more individuals, 2 mourning women, maybe Isis and Nephthys, several priests, but then, of course, it's the offering table underneath that is very interesting and significant. For one reason, it's very nicely represented. So we see the different colors of the adzes, the different instruments, the golden finger, the double feathers, the foreleg, the different vessels for water and incense, the little garments containing eye paint. Now, in the Book of the Dead, the inscriptions are not that explicit. So the texts that are part of the opening of the mouth proper are not found in their totality in the opening of the mouth, in the Book of the Dead rather, but they're found in an abbreviated way. Here it could be a visual way of communicating. And the top here, they have the purification sequence, which is a bit repetitive, but again, it talks about cool water and incense that are used to purify the deceased. Now, as I mentioned earlier tonight, in order for a temple to become effective, it too had to have the opening of the mouth performed on it. So these implements and vessels that are found here in 2 dimensions, some of which actually were recovered from the foundation deposit of the temple of Hatshepsut in this reconstruction at the Met Museum. They were supplemented by some modern wooden instruments to mimic the ancient objects, but the alabaster jars here are authentic. From Giza, and I want to thank Professor Dermanwalian and his staff for making all this information available online. We have miniature sets, again, of vessels. These are not hollowed out vessels. These are dummy vessels, if you will, of different sizes, different materials, but also that during the enactment of the ritual would have included different substances. These sets are often found placed in a tray like this one, and they're not by any means rare, and they were, I don't want to say common, but they were not rare in the Old Kingdom. So for instance, you can imagine that one of these little jars may be represented as a wasakh jar here with the little pellets of incense at the top. And the text at the top describes how this is a special kind of incense, and that the priest has come in order to open the mouth and the eyes of Aminirdis, shown here as a statue. Now, the earliest occurrence of the opening of the mouth dates to the 4th dynasty in the tomb of Mechen, which is now in Berlin. The entire ritual is not found in his tomb, but rather a very abbreviated phrase about the opening of his mouth, and that is followed by the word for sep, for, which is another function of this ritual, the act of repetition. It's not unique to the opening of the mouth ritual. It also occurs in the pyramid text. Sometimes different parts of the text would be followed by the circle with 2 dashes under it, or in this instance 4 dashes under it, and basically it means this is to be repeated 4 times in this instance, or repeated twice when there's only 2 dashes underneath. Think of this as if like when you're in a choir and after a certain stanza there are brackets times 2. You know, people don't repeat the stanza in print for lack of space, for economy, for whatever reason, and the same applied for the ancient Egyptian inscriptions as well. When something needed to be repeated several times, they would just place that sign after it, and then however number of times the text is to be repeated. So we can have very abbreviated representations of the ritual and very extensive representation of the ritual. Now back to the stela, the New Kingdom stela. Note the ads, note the different wasakh jars here used for the incense. So again, lack of space did not prevent them from including the essential elements. Which brings me to one of my main points today. The title of this entire ritual is opening of the mouth ritual. Ritual is there in the title. And a ritual is about performance. It's about something having meaning in a particular context. It's about tradition, and it's about repetition. And for the Egyptians, all these elements were important. Which ones to include depended on the space available, depended on the finances available, dependent on individual preferences as well as local traditions in funerary production in each area. So several factors impacted what we actually have, what we actually see. For instance, in this New Kingdom stela now in Turin, you'll see that the emphasis here is on the ritual purification, right? Even though this was one of the stela studied by Schulman and included in his study of New Kingdom stela bearing the opening of the mouth scenes. So this idea of ritual enactment is very important because it had several components, one of which was the presence of the appropriate materials, appropriate instruments, as we've seen throughout this presentation in the different slides, but also it had to do with the spoken word. And the spoken word already seen in the Tomb of Metchen, the emphasis on the repetition 4 times, 2 times, depending on the context. But the spoken word, the written word, were important for achieving the purpose of the deceased, the purpose of the ritual, and achieving an afterlife. And then the word was complemented by the act. The word was complemented by the material. The word was complemented by the instrument. You have to speak it as you did it. The action and the spoken word, the action and the speech, hand in hand, brought about the purification and the restoration of the senses for the deceased. One question I have had this year is why include scenes of the funeral, and specifically scenes of the opening of the mouth in stone in the Chapel of Eminerdis, but also elsewhere, including in Rahm Ure. You can see here, for instance, the same sign for step 4. This is to be repeated or recited 4 times. So the emphasis on repetition is there. But also to engrave this in stone is to ensure that her mouth will be opened for all eternity. Not just during the one time when it was enacted on her statue or on her mummy, but forever. Every time anyone entered and read those texts, it would magically happen for her. The other issue I've been looking at is any ritual needs ritualists, right? So who got to do what and when is something that I've been looking at very closely. There are certain characters that appear in the opening of the mouth ritual. When you read the seminal publication of that ritual by Otto, published in 1960, you have the list of Imigrenet priest, a Sem priest, a Kheri Habit priest. Okay, but there is no distinction of which priest did what. And I think it's important for us to try and dissect that because, again, a ritual is enacted. There is the actor or the ritualist, and there is the person being acted upon, the statue or the mummy of the deceased. These are agents, each of them. The person who did, as well as the person who selected. And that selection may have to do with, again, a tradition, a local tradition, a particular workshop. But because of the huge variety in the selection of opening of the mouth that we see in various monuments, even within the same time period, even in the same cemetery, like in the Asasif cemetery, I can't help but think that there must have been some input from the deceased himself or herself at the selection process. So selection, layout, who's the deceased, who are the ritualists represented, which priest got to touch which instrument, which priest got to handle which material, are all very important questions, and the answers are there. They're there in Otto's publication, they're there in the individual publications of the monuments, because they are there on the walls. The issue is to ask the question and to seek answers to these questions. And of course, the beautiful tomb from Seti, where unfortunately many of the ritualists' names and titles are missing because of the practice of cutting out the beautiful parts of the tomb and selling those parts on the market. Heartbreaking, but there is enough, and with the work on scanning Seti's tomb and hopefully digitally restoring the missing bits, we can more concretely know who did what and when. And possibly once we answer those questions, we can also get to the all-important question of why. Why would a king need his mouth opened? Why would Aminirdis have such a big selection? Why would her selection be different from the selection found in her contemporaries in Asasif, whether people who worked for her or people who did not, like Ptolemaeus? And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mariam. Fantastic topic and a complex one. And you've obviously given it a lot of thought, and it needs a lot of thought as well. We have a fair amount of questions if you're willing to take some of those.
Sure.
They are in the Q&A. And let's start with Chana, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Is there any significance to depicting the Sem priest with a side lock versus without a side lock? Does it only begin to appear with Seti I?
That's an excellent question. I have not done a lot of work on the iconography of the Sem priests. I would suggest that the side lock has to do with this relationship, supposedly between the Sem priest and the deceased, being the eldest son. So it's a sign of filiation. There's also been work done on the depiction of princes in the New Kingdom, generally speaking, and even though they may be adults, they are often shown with the side lock of youth. Definitely 19th dynasty onward. I'm trying to think in the tomb of Rahmi I don't believe the Sem priests have side locks there, but I can go back and check. I'd be happy to.
Great. So a few people are wondering if you can back up a little bit and I think help them a little bit with the basics. So Elise and Beth, one is asking why the mouth needed to be opened, and you touched on that in your concluding remarks. And another is asking about whether you could talk in a broad outline about the main steps in the ritual or cite an appropriate reference. So do you have a favorite go-to publication that you would refer beginners to get comfortable with the ritual?
Yes, the article by Alan Schulman in Jarsi, 1984, has a good synopsis of the ritual. He discusses the New Kingdom stela that have the abbreviated version of the ritual. The ritual sequence is one of the things I've been working on because obviously as it's published, it's very messed up. It differs from one tomb to the other. I've noticed that sometimes the butchery scenes may appear near or at the entrance to a tomb or a chapel, like in Aminirdis, but also in some Ramesside tombs that were published by Osman. So back to the more general questions, what's the purpose of that ritual? Generally speaking, it's to restore the senses for the deceased. So not only was the mouth touched and opened, but also the eyes. And in the longer version of the title of the ritual, it says opening the eyes, the two eyes and the mouth of so-and-so. Now, the restoration of the senses was important because in ancient Egyptian culture, the deceased needed to be able to eat in the afterlife, to breathe, to talk, to answer the different questions posed to him or her by the different gods. You can't answer if your mouth is not open. So the opening of the mouth is an essential step to being able to stand before the tribunal. It's an essential step for breathing, as we know from later versions of that ritual, Roman versions. The opening of the mouth for breathing is the title there. You needed the sight restored, you needed the hearing restored. So in different episodes, the eyes are touched, the ears are touched. A number of years ago, I started trying to link the different instruments with the different body parts that were touched, but it didn't seem consistent enough to draw a conclusion. But there's so much more to be done with this ritual. I think unlocking it may be a good way to unlock many aspects of the Egyptian thought process and their beliefs about the afterlife. And especially this idea of who did what, with what, and the association of material with the body part that's being touched with, and that association with the actor or the ritualists. I think these unlock a lot of insights.
I've always wondered too, with all of those body parts that need to be touched, when you see the representation of all the equipment lying there and you have 5 adzes, is it 1 adze per piece or per person, or are they just duplicates being represented as spares? Have you ever thought about counting?
No, they have different names. Mm-hmm. The adzes have different names. The Meskhetiou adze, for instance, is always used in chapter 27. And again, I'm using the numbers for convenience, but that's the innermost one in Amenirdes and in Seti. And it's one of the longest as well. And that's the one made of meteoric iron, extraterrestrial iron.
Right. So Ekaterina is asking, wondering if the mourning women in the rituals are ever identified in any way, either by name or otherwise.
Sometimes they're identified as kites.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not always labeled, but when they're labeled, they are labeled as kites.
Mm-hmm. And Deborah Hurd is asking, hi, Deborah, was there a community of was there a commonality of elements and or texts in the rituals of the gods' wives? Were there common elements in the 25th dynasty?
Among the gods' wives or between the gods' wives and other people?
I imagine she means among the gods' wives, among the different chapters there.
Among the gods' wives, I'm very sad to report that Amenirdes has the only selection of funerary texts that we have in the chapels. There's 5 chapels, and Amenirdes, the chapel of Amenirdes is the one with the texts. The rest have offering scenes and nothing more. Mm-hmm. There is the sarcophagus of Anchenes Nefer Ibra at the British Museum, which interestingly has more in common with the texts on the sarcophagi of later Nubian kings rather than with the texts of Amenirdes. So Anchenes Nefer Ibra has the Our Watchers or Stundenwachen and other cryptic texts. But that's like comparing apples and oranges because we don't have the sarcophagus of Amenirdes. So we don't know what was on it. Mm-hmm. And the chapel of Anchenes Nefer Ibra was destroyed in antiquity.
Right. And Jane is wondering, does the ritual purification preserve the corpse, as in embalming?
The opening of the mouth happened after embalming, as far as I understand it, as far as I understand the sequence. The ritual purification, that's a very good question. I think it doesn't have to do with preserving the body itself in the sense of embalming, but it has to do with making sure that the deceased is pure enough to stand before the gods. Mm-hmm. So the purification is enacted using a variety of materials, including cool water, but also different kinds of incense. And in the layout of the scenes, you have one spell or one chapter purifying the deceased with cool water, and then the next with a different type of incense, and then cool water, and then another type of incense, so they're interchangeable, or one after the other. And the purification is always linked to the purification of Horus. So it's being pure, but also being almost godly, purified as Horus.
Right.
And the grammar used is it's like an A-B sentence. So A is B. So your purification is the purification of Horus. So complete equivalence is my point.
Okay. And Scott is wondering if you could speak to the significance of the Sem priest's leopard skin.
Oh, I wish I could, but they're very fashionable. No, I don't know specifically that anyone has looked at why the leopard skin, apart from saying it's the characteristic garment of a Sem priest. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
the short answer, I don't know, but it's a very good question. I wish I knew why that.
It goes all the way back to the Old Kingdom too.
Yes, where women actually had some leopard skin garments.
Mm-hmm. And Inji is wondering if the husband of a deceased woman has a role in the ritual.
The short answer, no. As far as we know. Now, of course, it could be that one of these priests is the actual husband. We don't know because the priests are not named by name. They're only named by title. The only inscription refers to their title, not to their individual names. Also, Anne Macy Roth, who's giving a lecture as we speak tonight, she has a wonderful paper about the absent spouse and how it was taboo for a woman to represent her husband in her funerary monument for reasons that have to do with relative hierarchical status. At least in the Old Kingdom, that seems to be true. Also in the tomb of Nefertari, that seems to be true. In the chapel of Aminirdis, there's no husband represented. And of course, that led everyone to think they were celibate as God's wives. But no husband is represented, as far as I know.
And I like this one by Ahmed Allah. How long did it take by priests and ritualists to perform the opening of the mouth ritual? So I love that one. Any sense of the length of the ritual?
I would say as long as it took to read the texts, and as long as it took to recite the texts.
And repeat them 4 times.
And repeat them 4 times. I think that the actual burning of the incense or the pouring of it over a statue may not have taken long at all, but it's in the recitation. And again, that's what I tried to demonstrate tonight, that the speech is as important as the ritual act. They complemented one another, but neither was completely effective without the other.
Mm-hmm. Well, people are really getting into the details of the scenes here. This is fascinating. Here's one from Mintam. I noticed there was not only the phrase Zep4 on the walls, but also visual repetition of the scenes, such as the pouring of the water over Aminirdis. Are those literal repetitions, or are they just variations on a theme, as we see in some Book of the Dead vignettes?
Both. I'm glad you caught on the repetition issue, because actually that's what got me started doing the opening of the mouth in more detail. Let me backtrack a little bit. For my dissertation, I did the entire corpus found in Aminirdis, which included the pyramid texts and the solar hymns. And for the lower register, where the other genres are inscribed, everything is so brief. She's not shortchanged at all. Everything she needs for the afterlife in terms of pyramid texts, she gets, including purification, linen, crowns, whatever she needs to be powerful among the gods and to survive in the afterlife. But out of the hundreds of spells available to her of the pyramid texts, she only had 8 or 9. So when I got to the opening of the mouth on the upper register, I was surprised at the amount of repetition there. In the purification scenes that you picked up on, there is slight variation. So different substances are used, or even when it's water, then different jars are used. But at the door, near the door on the north wall of Aminirdis, where you have the ritual slaughter of an ox, these 2 scenes, 23 and 43, are repeated verbatim. So that clued me into this idea of the parallel reading, perhaps. And I was very intrigued that in the same monument where certain texts were so, concise in their selection and use, on the same monument, on the same walls, there would be that much repetition. It led me to conclude that the repetition was about ritual reenactment. So that's why I suggested that the priests read as they entered simultaneously, because the repetition on the long walls is not directly correspondent. So it's not point A equals point A here. It's rather diagonal, so that if 2 people are reading the text on the one side and on the other, their collective reading would give Eminerdis, whatever she needed at the same time. And then they repeated differently at 4 steps forward. But again, she would get the totality and the total benefit of the 2 sides being chanted or recited or spoken out loud at the same time. Now, people who've known about my work have not always embraced this idea of the parallel reading or even a contingent of priests going in, because there's only room for 1 person. It's a very narrow corridor, but they could file in, single file, or it could be just 1 person on either side, because if it's about the spoken word, you only need someone to read it and to recite it. And of course, there are people who think of this as pure wallpaper still.
I think we have time for just a couple more. One of them was a request to mention the book that you showed again and the author. Maybe you could discuss that one. The book mentioned again, or share the title and the author again. I could not read the cover because it's too faint on my screen.
Oh,
so that has to do with your background screen and holding it up. So.
I think I showed one book, which is Liber Funerali by Schiaparelli. It will be found in libraries that have rare books and special collections, but not much.
Tough one to find, yeah.
Not much elsewhere. But also, if you're interested in the Book of the Dead, in the opening of the mouth ritual itself, then the publication by Otto.
So Eberhard Otto, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Also fairly hard to find, I would think. Easier
than Schiaparelli. And then, of course, I highly recommend, which I didn't get to speak out during my presentation, Harvard's Egyptological Studies, Volume 4, The Performative Structure, because I like how Niels Bieling here is treating the pyramid texts of Pepi I as a corpus to be read and understood and enacted as a unit, as a unity. And as I said, it's valuable to have the side-by-side line publications, but also it's very interesting to see how the texts in one monument help achieve the purpose of the owner of that monument. Of that monument.
And that book, you needed to hold it up a little higher so people could see the author's name there, Nico starring as well. Yeah, hard to see when you're on a background.
There,
a little higher.
If I go higher, it disappears.
Yeah. And for those wondering what JARCE is, that stands for the Journal of the American Research Center in Egypt. And you can find their website at arce.org. And you can find our website at HMSC, so Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. And the last question we'll end on is, was the ads and the golden finger, were they interchangeable?
Yes and no. So they were interchangeable in the sense that they were all held up by the priest to the mouth and eyes and ears of the mummy or the statue of the deceased. They were not interchangeable in the sense that that again, according to our system, there are numbers for the scenes, and when a scene occurs, it always occurs with the specific instrument. So whenever you need the meteoric ads instrument, like say in chapter 27, you will always have that. Golden finger is usually in scenes in the range of 30s, like 31, 32, 33, and that's always the case. And that is one of the reasons why people are so wedded still to these numbers, because they are discrete scenes, right? And whatever is found in one scene may not be found necessarily exactly in the next. I just object to the numbers when they don't take into account the layout in a particular monument.
Right. Well, it's so important the way you've shown that this is not just interchangeable wallpaper that gets thrown up on the walls of these shrines in any kind of willy-nilly fashion, but there's an awful lot of thought and care that goes into that as well. So apologies, we can't get to all of the rest of the questions. I think our time is drawing to a close. But Mariam, thank you so much for giving us a deep dive into this important ritual that had such a long lifetime and interesting variants. And we're looking forward to your publications coming out of this down the road.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. And thank you to the 200 people who have stayed on even through the Q&A
It's a wonderful audience.
Yeah.
So stay with us. Do become a member of HMSC if you're not already, and we can promise you there will be more programs coming along in the fall semester when we pick up again, not to mention all the various summer programs on Zoom and elsewhere that we have in store. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.